Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the African University's Gender Equality Forum, which is hosted by the Shared Value Africa Gender Equality Unit. My name is Joy Ruodo, which Peach has already alluded to, and it's my honor to be able to host this session as your moderator today on a very significant day, which is the 10th of December. It is also the closing of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. So today really was intentionally positioned to be here on the last day, not at the beginning of the campaign, but at the point where we find that most voices start to slow down and where we start to see witness advocacy fatigue. So I think it's wonderful that we have these landmark calendar days and events to cast a spotlight on this very important issue. But the reality is that it's a very important issue every single day. While campaigns come to a pause, the reality is that students, that women, particularly women and gender diverse persons face, do not actually pause. And so when it comes to universities remain both aspirational spaces, but they're simultaneously sites of harm. They're places of learning, places of leadership, of curiosity, but we also find that they're places where oftentimes gender-based violence is normalized, where reporting systems often fail survivors and accountability is inconsistently applied. Research has shown that about 10% of all rape cases that are reported nationally actually stem from higher education institutions. And so that's why it's important for us to be having this conversation today. Our theme is Universities for Purple, which I think should not be strange to many of you, having seen the Purple campaign and what it did during this period of time. Purple, we're looking at it as purple as dignity, restoring the right to safety and belonging. We're looking at purple as justice, moving beyond just acknowledgement into actual consequences. And then we're also looking at purple as strength, elevating student voices. So in terms of the purpose for today, I would say it's threefold. It's to amplify the lived realities of gender-based violence and harassment in university spaces. It's also to ignite thinking around psychological space, safety, and structural reform, and then to activate young leaders into a visible movement. And so it's not just us having a conversation for the sake of having yet another conversation, yet another webinar, but it's really about us actually setting the agenda and beyond this, making progress and starting to actually action some of the things that we discuss. I noted at the beginning, a couple of people started introducing themselves in the chat. I would invite you all to please to introduce yourself in the chat platform if you haven't. Tell us your name, the organization or the university that you're with, and your role, and perhaps even where you're tuning in from today. Would love to hear from you. Before I begin, I'd love to actually share an inspiring video from the recent Women for Change Purple campaign. And I'm sure many of you actually responded to the call and changed your WhatsApp profile picture to the purple block. So I'd like to invite you all to turn your attention to the screens and let's have a look at this inspiring video. Thank you.
I hear you whisper underneath your breath. I hear your SOS, your SOS.
Thank you so much, Peach. And I'm sure for many of you, you looked at it and it really gave you inspiration. It's incredible that we were able, many of us, to be a part of this movement. And so I'm very excited today about one of the speakers that we'll have on the platform who's actually from Women for Change. So very much at the front and center of everything that you saw in that video. Before we move on, I'd like to hear from you, our audience, to hear from you on perhaps where you stand at the moment. And we want to do that through launching a quick poll, which will pop up on your screen. It really is just a dipstick test. So please have a look at the question, which is, how familiar are you with the issue of gender-based violence and harassment? How familiar are you with the issue? Your responses could be very familiar, somewhat familiar, not very familiar, or not familiar at all. So please take a moment to fill in your response and let's have a look. What happened? What happened? I'm giving a couple of moments, a few seconds to have others respond to the poll question. And for those of you who haven't taken the opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat, please take a moment to do so. Let us know who you are, where you're from, in terms of your organization or the institution that you're with, and what country or city you're dialing in from. In a couple of seconds, I think we'll be able to see the poll results. Peach, I'll wait for you to let me know when you're ready. And there we go. I think this is really encouraging. So the question for those who might have joined a little bit later is, how familiar are you with the issue of gender-based violence and harassment? Whether you're very familiar, somewhat familiar, not very familiar, or not familiar at all. I must say I'm thrilled to see that there's no one who's completely oblivious to it, that the majority, 89%, are actually familiar with the issue of gender-based violence and harassment. And I say this because I think very often one of the challenges that we face is that people are violated simply because they don't actually know where to draw the line. There's so much that has been normalized on the basis of our cultures, our races, our religions, even just our social backgrounds and our upbringing. So very often, things are done and we don't recognize that it's an actual violation. So I'm pleased to see that the majority of people on the... Without further ado, I would love to introduce our next speaker, who is actually our keynote speaker, and that is Cameron. But before I do so, can you just let me know, Peach, around the question that was posed? Cameron, I know you had wanted to use slides. Peach, is it possible for Cameron to share her slides?
Yes, it is. Cameron, you can go ahead and share your slides.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. So as you get Cameron ready, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to Cameron, and I think I alluded to it before. Really, she is someone who's been involved in a really influential advocacy movement and ensuring that we keep the national spotlight on gender-based violence in South Africa. I know that they did a lot around the G20, but I don't want to steal her thunder. I want to make sure that Cameron has the opportunity to share more. Cameron's activism centers around public accountability, around survivor storytelling and legislative pressure, which I think we saw very well in action in the last month or two. Women for Change has managed to mobilize national conversations around femicide, workplace harassment, systemic failures, and the imperative of social response. So Cameron, without further ado, I'd want to welcome you and invite you to unmute and please share.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. As you mentioned, I'm Cameron Kasambala, and I am the spokesperson at Women for Change. I think before I start on anything I do, I just want to give a bit of a background about who Women for Change is and the work we do. So Women for Change is a prominent South African organization that's a nonprofit that shines a spotlight on the country's devastating gender-based violence statistics and femicide crisis. We use the power of social media, reaching over 520,000 followers and generating 40 million impressions each month to amplify survivor stories and demand justice. What that means is that we make sure that, as much as we're called keyboard warriors, we utilize a platform that allows us to access people across the world to push out a message and bring attention to gender-based violence and femicide. So what do? We raise awareness about GBV and femicide realities and give voice to survivors. So you might have seen on social media, we're often posting memorial posts in honor of women that have been killed due to femicide. We post about different cases and stories that are coming up within South Africa to bring attention to the movements that are happening within South Africa, even when no one's talking about it. Because I think what can happen is, since there's so much happening, a lot of stories can get missed. And so our want is to make sure stories are being heard. We educate the public about prevention, legislation, and rights. With all of the different movements that are happening, we want to make sure that our community and the rest of South Africa is aware of what exists within South Africa, how things are going, and the progress being made. We support survivors through offering referrals, whether that's legal, medical, or psychological services that are free, because within South Africa, unfortunately, it is very expensive at times to get help, and it can be very distressing on figuring out what the next steps are. So people come to us for safety, to be able to come and have these very important conversations so that we can support them as best as we can. And then we advocate for reform, pushing policymakers to act and labeling GBV a national crisis, which I think is very fitting for what's happened now. So what is the Purple Movement? The Purple Movement is a name that actually has gone rampant within social media, but it came from the attention of the women's shutdown that we wanted to host on the 21st of November that we did on the Friday. The national shutdown was very important because what we wanted to do was disrupt the South African economy and bring them to a standstill. We wanted to show them the consequences of our economic and social absence. I think the statistics within South Africa are so scary, and I just want to give a few just to show the magnitude of what gender-based violence and femicide looks like within South Africa. So in the past year, we saw a 33.8% increase in femicide rates, and what that meant was that we had 5,578 women that had been killed within South Africa, and that amounts to about 15 women every single day. We also have 117 rape cases reported every single day, and that's only 5% of the cases. And so we are known as the rape capital of the world, and our femicide rate is 6 times the global average. So our numbers are terrifying. So at the beginning of this year, we did a demonstration on the 11th of April, handing over a petition memorandum to ask the government to declare gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster. Post this demonstration, we received minimal response in which the government essentially said to us that they have already put everything in place and that there was no further work for them to do. This would make sense in the terms of the paper and the information that's put on paper. So we have beautiful legislations and policies in place. We have the Domestic Violence Act, the Protection from Harassment Act. We have the National Strategic Plan to tackle GBV and femicide. But the reality is that implementation is severely lacking. And so that is what led us to deciding to do the shutdown, to really force South Africa to listen to what is happening. In terms of how it worked and what we asked for women and members of the LGBTQI+ community to refrain from going to work, whether that was paid or unpaid labor. We asked them to not engage with the economy, so that's withdrawing money or making purchases. We asked everyone to wear black in mourning. We had the profile pictures turning purple, which is, I think, what really began to stem the Purple Movement that became so global and international, was those purple profile pictures. And we had a 15-minute lie down at 12 o'clock to honor the 15 women killed every single day. So our intention with the day was to really depict what happens when we are not there. Because as our government continues to be very negligent of us as citizens, that means that we are being killed every single day. And unfortunately, when you're dead, you do not do anything. You do not engage with the economy. You do not show your social presence. You do not do anything. And I think that's what we really wanted to depict. And so the day was almost a day of mourning. So then why a shutdown? Shutdowns are interesting because they're a bit of a paradox. We use silence to create noise. We withdraw our presence to prove our value to the country. We utilize the moments of silence to really disrupt what's happening. So we make the invisible visible to them. Often we are taken for granted in terms of labor, whether that's social, emotional, digital, and that we are constantly overlooked within South Africa. So instead, what we do is we force them to acknowledge us by seeing that we're not there. This kind of emphasizes that we hold space in this country and that we have so much value that we add within the country. It also creates a unified front. We create instant, powerful solidarity, which is what the purple profile pictures showed. It created visibility to this movement that was happening and garnered worldwide attention. And as much as it doesn't require too much to join, which I think was important to us, is that it didn't demand that people show up in particular locations. It allowed for a high visual impact from across the country, of which people could do it anywhere and anytime. It also forces a narrative shift. We ask the question, why did they leave? Why are there no women at work? Why are there no queer people at work? And we begin to have this conversation and it spotlights the issue, not the protester. It starts to push the narrative around, well, if they're absent, what is causing them to be absent? And then they began to ask questions about why are they doing this shutdown, which led to conversations about gender-based violence and femicide. And I think that's why so many people across the world became so invested, is because they too had an understanding of the importance of recognizing how bad GBV is across the world, but particularly within South Africa. It generated real friction. It hit platform engagement. So on social media, it got a lot of attention. But for the government, it is very uncomfortable for them to have their economy being disrupted in the way that it was. And so it forced them to begin to have a conversation and acknowledge what was happening, because their economy was taking a hit. And at this time, the G20 event was about to begin. And so this was the time when international attention was on South Africa, and we were trying to portray this strong and stable economy. And now we had brought the country to a shutdown and a standstill. And then it builds internal power. It provides a safer collective action that allows for pause and regrouping and solidarity. We made the decision not to do a protest or take to the streets, one for the safety of our different participants and keeping them protected, but also because the shutdown was intended to be silent and have that kind of impact. So then, what were the results? The president actually classified gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster on the 20th of November, which was a day before the shutdown. What that meant was that the government acknowledged that the magnitude of the issue and admitted that urgent action needed to be taken to tackle gender-based violence and femicide. The classification means that there will be stronger reinforcement of existing legislation and policy, such as the National Strategic Plan to tackle gender-based violence. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of fantastic frameworks and policies, so there was no need for new words on paper. There was need for stronger implementation, and that meant audits providing all details in terms of transparency around funding that was released. It meant releasing reports on exactly how implementation would be happening. So training processes, how were people being trained, the content of training, the curriculums for the comprehensive sexual education programs, just very much a transparent report on exactly what we're doing, as well as an accountability that is to be expected. I think the reality when these kind of things are happening is that we wonder, okay, what exactly comes next? What can we expect from our government? And it can be very scary because we've gotten a lot of high-level promises from the government, and it's very clear that they know what to say, but what does that mean in terms of action for us? So what is next? Gender-based violence is a 365 days battle, not just a 16 days battle. And gender-based violence continues to remain rampant within the South African context. So for us as change makers and as part of civil society and as citizens within South Africa, we have to keep the pressure on our government. We have to keep the momentum going. And I think it's beautiful that we're doing this at the end of the gender-based violence 16 days of GBV, because as you mentioned earlier, this is something that cannot lose momentum. Just because we have this classification doesn't mean that we can now relinquish pressure. Just because we've seen 16 days ending doesn't mean that GBV is now over. And I think that's so important to emphasize, is that this is what allows governments to hide. When we release pressure and when we stop calling them out and paying attention to the work they're doing, they get to lift their hands up and they get to relax. And we don't want them to relax. We've gotten this far and we require diligent effort. And this battle is long, and I don't want to make it sound like it's going to happen overnight. And we've seen it with other movements that have happened. It can take decades to get real change, but change does come with consistent, committed effort. And for the work that we're doing and the progress that we're seeing, we can already begin to see that change is happening. And I think that we have to remind ourselves that we are the change. We are making things happen. And as long as we keep the momentum and pressure going, we will see real implementation happening. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. And I can just feel the energy that you're exuding through just the camera. So, and when we looked at that video earlier on, I just wanted to be in there myself. I think you're doing incredible work. And thank you so much for grounding us in this reality of the fact that we can't be societally complacent, that there is an urgent need for visible action and advocacy. So there are a number of things that you said that really stuck for me. And one which we know is the fact that the femicide rate of South Africa is 6 times the global average. I think it is extremely alarming. And I was thinking about it as you were speaking, and I don't quite remember when we learned or understood the word femicide. I feel like for a long time, it wasn't an issue, and then it suddenly became a very well-known issue, and the scourge seems to be just escalating. And as I think about what you have done, and the fact that on this platform, we have many student activists, other activists and champions on this platform, I really would love for you to share the model for success. And I know you did it in your presentation in a way, but I think would love if you could share some tangible guidance or advice or nuggets for the people on this call around leading a movement, in particular, the aspect of, I would say, partnership and collaboration. There was a point at which I couldn't turn my head and not see purple. It seemed like you were everywhere, and I thought it was incredible. So what nugget would you love to leave with the participants today for those who are eager to lead change?
I think there's 2 things I would love to lead them with, and the first is that Women for Change did not start overnight. We started in 2016, and Sabrina, our founder, worked diligently for almost 10 years now to get it to where it was. It wasn't an overnight change that happened. It took so much work on her part, many hours of her life to just dedicate to this organization and the movement. And I think that's very telling that that kind of commitment and work is what allowed her to have this kind of reaction and response. And so I think that's the first thing. It's not overnight. It does not happen immediately, but it does take diligent effort. And I think that's what I said earlier, which is you've got to commit to the movement. You've got to commit to the process. When we did our handover in April, we had about 170,000 signatures, and we thought we did the biggest thing ever. We were like, you know what? This is great progress. We've done fantastic work. When we did the shutdown and we reached over 1 million signatures, and we were seeing the whole world turning purple, we were seeing protests and solidarity happening across the world, we thought, how did 5 people make this happen? But it's that consistent effort that needed to keep going, that we needed to keep pushing. The second thing I would say is don't underestimate the power of starting small. I think we can imagine doing this big shutdown and this global event, and that's what we need to do. And the reality is actually, from a grassroots on the ground level, we can start so small. And I think I can speak to the different levels of speaking out. And I think it's so important to emphasize this, is that there are many ways to speak out. Unfortunately, a lot of us might even be victims to gender-based violence and femicide. We might know someone who's a victim of that. And it starts off just simply having a one-on-one conversation and holding a safe space for someone to speak up, to listen to them, to allow them safety. That has such a powerful impact to hold someone safely within a space. We can go a bit bigger. We can work within our institutions. Maybe we'll want to hold a day of education. We want to have a GBV day. We want to teach people about consent and boundaries. We want to hold our own little 16 days of GBV within our schools or within our communities. You know, we can use powerful platforms like social media, art, creativity to bring attention to stories, to bring awareness. And then we can do movements like this that kind of go a bit bigger, where we do these standstills and these marches and these protests. But it doesn't start just from there. You can do so much before then. And if you do want to do something bigger, our biggest thing is safety. At the end of the day, you need to be safe. We cannot do things and not protect the people who are participating. And I think that's why our shutdown was so important, is we wanted people to be safe and protected. So but above all else, as much as we want to fight this battle, let people be safe and protected. We do not need people to be killed, attacked, and violated as we do this work. We can do so much. And you can see now, we moved in silence, and in silence, we had this happen. We had this big change happen. So there's so many ways we could show up. I think that's kind of the nuggets I would leave them with.
Fantastic. And I could see a number of hands going up. I think if we could just give this team a round of applause, because I think what you've done is phenomenal. Thank you so much. I love the fact that at the end of your talk, you were talking about what next. Because yes, so now there is this, categorization. But then what? What does it mean for you and me and everyone else who demands or requests safety as they go about their day-to-day lives? So thank you so much, Cameron. Really, really appreciate your time and the thoughts that you've shared with us. Really important. Thank you.
Thank you again so much for having me.
Wonderful. So we'd like to now move and shift into a lens that sits inside institutions, looking at the emotional cost, the psychological burden, and the support frameworks that must exist if students are to thrive. So I'd like to now move on to our second keynote, and this is a voice of someone who understands trauma-informed support from inside university systems. I'd like to welcome Yumna, who is a survivor support specialist for the University of Cape Town, in the Office for Inclusivity and Change. She's also a counselor, a facilitator, a researcher in trauma healing pathways. She's worked extensively with students navigating post-violence trauma with university reporting systems, dignity restoration, and institutional accompaniment. So her work really centers on recovery as a structured path, not just the emotional response. And she advocates for survivor-centered accountability frameworks. And I think it really is important for us to touch on that subject today, because very often we know, and our statistics have shown us, that most instances of violence, harassment, GBV go unreported. And in fact, we have the privilege of just having completed research in Kenya on the cost of gender-based violence and harassment to the private sector in Kenya. And an alarming statistic was that 86% of cases go unreported. So can you imagine if only 14% are being reported? And the reason for that is the victim blaming, the victim shaming, the fear of retaliation, and many, many other issues. So, Yumna, I invite you on stage. Please take over and share with us.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much. I just want to check that I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, you
Yes,
are.
you are.
All right, thank you. So before we begin, I'd like to invite everyone to take a moment to have a deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. And just acknowledge that what we're talking about today is heavy, and it can be, can you hear me? And it can be overwhelming, but that we're here together and to support one another. All right. So today I'll be trying to cover quite a bit of information in a short amount of time, but let's see what we can do. I was asked to focus today on the shared commitment and accountability to the collective voice and to systems that protect rather than re-traumatize survivors. And this is a big one because there's many layers to it. And I would like to share that from the Office for Inclusivity and Change within UCT, we have shifted over the last 5 years to build some of the structures that looks at survivor support frameworks, academic concessions, residence interventions, and staffing training, but it's not enough. And that's why today's conversation is so important for us to think about beyond offering available support versus felt safety from students and staff members on campus. Okay. So in terms of how I engage with students who have experienced sexual violence or any form of GBV and femicide, I'm not treating the incident as the sole problem. I'm looking beyond that. I'm looking at what type of system procedural support does this person need. I'm looking at more than the incident. I'm looking at the individual who has had to go through this lived experience and how this lived experience is going to shift so many areas of their lives. And how is it that the institution can build into supporting and making safety not just grounded in physical safety, but psychological, academic, social safety, and so forth. So let's just break it down a little bit more in terms of where do we see gender-based violence in higher educational settings as a systems problem? Where are we failing our students? It can be in residence spaces. So this is literally in shared dining halls, bathrooms, rooms, the actual living rooms. That is everyday places that's supposed to make an individual feel safe, yet it becomes a high-risk area. What about initiating practices and social events? How do we make safety not just about the physical element of being safe, but how do we go a step further to think about how does this event contribute to psychological safety? Are the students that are attending this event already attending with I need to be mindful. I need to be looking over my shoulder. I need to keep distance from myself. So are they already entering into a social engagement with an activated nervous system because of the fear of experiencing gender-based violence? So how can this institution and these residents create and shift the norm that students have now in terms of I need to look over my shoulder because I could experience an incident of sexual and gender-based violence? We need to look at how all academic group work, classroom engagement, whether online or in person, as well as in the residence spaces, again, leads or breeds coercion, and how it's so difficult for survivors to actually acknowledge what's happening, that they are being coerced in many things. So we really need to look at how are we able to look at these small pockets of areas collectively to realize the impact of it, because we will find survivors that are sitting away, like 3 rows away from someone who's harmed them, or not wanting or attending class because of fear, psychological fear, as well as physical fear that they may have. So essentially what I'm saying is survivors aren't only enduring the original harm of the incident and violation, they are having to endure what happens afterwards, which is the waiting, the silence, the evidence fatigue, the academic disruption, the social complexities, as well as the sudden loss of friends and support systems. So when we are looking at this, we need to look at it that you're not only holding the trauma of what happened, but you're looking at the relationship, and we need to look and think about how are our processes as institutions doing a disjustice to the survivor's psychological safety and overall well-being. Delayed disciplinary processes, inconsistency in applied policies, power hierarchies in residence, in departments, in classrooms, and I would say another one is loneliness of reporting into emotionally unsafe systems. And an example of this is, for example, a survivor may feel very supported by me, and my reach ends at a certain point. And all I can then do is advocate on behalf of the survivor. But in terms of the power, the decisions of continuing that safety, it could lie with a department or dean in terms of the academic progress or the academic support. So we need to acknowledge that one safe physical space or one survivor support specialist is not enough for the lived experience of this survivor, and how we actually need to form a chain of support throughout the institution, throughout the different departments and societies and spaces and so forth, that we're not just looking at, oh, you need to go to the reporting department of your institution and they will support you. No, we all have a role to build, or rather to rebuild, the sense of safety for the survivor. And so by thinking about it here in this lens, we really asking ourselves to look at our institutions and where we are unintentionally becoming a secondary site of trauma, right? So it's not about what as an institution we do and how we take responsibility. It's about looking at trauma and how it doesn't distinguish between a first-year student, a postgraduate, a researcher, a tutor, a student leader, a staff member. And it doesn't differentiate between those different roles, but rather it builds consistent safety and safe engagements with the survivor to make them feel seen, protected, and believed, which will help them in terms of understanding what is going on with me, what am I experiencing, what is shifting, and what type of support do I need. And then they will be able to communicate that to the institution, and we're able to move then from a place of offering safety to practicing safety, to practicing or laying the pathway down for the survivor to grow, to find their voice again, to empower themselves, and to walk the journey alongside the survivor to post-traumatic growth. I'm conscious of time, so the next couple of points, I'm going to try to go a lot more faster. And basically, just to reiterate from what I was sharing earlier, is that a trauma-informed campus is not simply about a counseling center, a 24-hour reporting line, or a reporting process. We need to understand how trauma impacts learning, memory, behavior, identity, emotional regulation, and safety most of all. Okay, so when we're saying this, what does this look like? Apologies about that. So it looks like where a survivor struggling to concentrate in class after seeing the respondent in a lecture. Even though they're in counseling, that sets them back, and that may then have a knock-on effect on attending the tutorial the next day or the same day, or submitting that assignment that's due at 12 o'clock that evening. Looking at how panic, seeing a respondent in close proximity, and how panic can disrupt your concentration, your exam performance, because your brain is registering and saying, here is threat and danger. And so you then go into fight, flight, and freeze. And what we're seeing on a daily basis that a survivor needs to do or experiences is being in fight, flight, and freeze and not coming into social engagement. So their body feels, or they're rather holding in a constant pattern of stress, hypervigilance, emotional and cognitive shutdown, panic, disassociation, and I would say chronic exhaustion. And we need to not be a system or an institution that is not recognizing these patterns that of stress that cause the stress, and we need to do better, essentially. So we need to allow for academic accommodations that actually address and reflect how cognition and functioning capacity is impaired after sexual trauma and ongoing when in a shared space of engagement with the respondent. We need to look at how trauma responses impact the daily life of the survivor. We need to have people who are not just aware of secondary trauma or post-traumatic symptoms, but really people who know how to support someone who's going through this. So we need to understand the behavior that is shaped as a response to the ongoing threat a survivor experiences. And that way we can shift healing to become not just being safe enough to walk on campus, but it needs to be safe enough to allow for healing to grow. And with that, we ask ourselves, Who absorbs risk when a student reports? Who carries the emotional and academic burden while a case is open? Who is protected when reputational anxiety arises? The survivor or the institution? So real reform requires us to think about ethically grounding leadership, not just procedural authority or procedural protocols, cross-department accountability, transparent communication, not protective silence. And we need to ask ourselves, is my institution being compliant? No, that's not what we should be asking. That's often what we hear. Are we being compliant? The national legislation law, our policies, are we compliant to this? But that is dehumanizing the individual, the survivor who went through a lived experience. We need to shift and ask, are we safe? Are our students safe in res, in class, online engagements? Are they safe? Do they have the understanding of the complexities of domestic violence, both back home and being in intimate partner relationships for the first time, or in a different way than what was shaped and experienced prior? So we need to look at how reform does not fail because of lack of information. We cannot use that anymore. We need to understand it as reform fails when courage does not reach decision-making tables. Through a survivor-centered and trauma-informed lens. So we can often speak about healing that survivors must do. They must go for counseling, they must do it privately. And that is, again, isolating them. Healing needs to be systematic. Protection needs to be visible. Communication from the university needs to be predictable. And that way accountability becomes real. So we are able to foster an environment that focuses and centers on post-traumatic growth for those who are affected by sexual and gender-based violence. I am just checking on time. If I have 2 minutes.
So Yumna, the time is not great, but what you're imparting is so important. So I'm more than happy to give you 2 minutes. But as you do that, you've shared earlier on, I noticed that we have people joining, students from Kenya, from South Africa, from Nigeria, from Uganda. And you said something about the importance of trauma-informed campuses. So as you continue, I would love for anyone who has a great example from across the continent of campuses that are applying trauma-informed approaches. So please continue, Yumna.
Thank you so much. So in closing, I want us just to reflect. And for example, not all institutions have this, right? But we need to look at how our institution can grow with the survivor. Not expect the survivors to outgrow a broken system. So understanding the purple movement, for example, it shouldn't just be a color or a campaign that ends today, or even this platform of today's engagement. It's not. We can't look at it like, oh, we attended something and this is where it ends. Okay, so we need to look at how can our institution commit for trauma-informed leadership, survivor-centered reporting engagements and time frames, ethical accountability across the hierarchy, safety that is operational, not aspirational, not reaching to that goal, but now, present, lived experience. Okay, we need to look at how we can disrupt harmful norms now, not in the future, now. We need to embed it in everyday engagement as staff members engaging with students, as students engaging with students, not in a workshop, because that doesn't translate into everyday action. So we need to challenge sexist and coercive jokes in social spaces. We need to support survivors without pressure or exposure that they are not ready for. We need to speak with care. We need to hold space with being authentic and looking at centering the person in front of us and not the incident. I know what I'm going to say is a bit controversial, but sometimes as social activists or people who advocate for survivors, it's easy for us to lose focus of the person in front of us and to look at the political scheme of sexual and gender-based violence. And I'm asking us to keep at the forefront of our mind, to pause. And as much as that work is important to make a shift on a larger impact scale, we need to first start with the person in front of us to make sure that we ourselves are being a safe environment and body for this person to feel held and to receive strength from us. And so we must not overlook the person because we're focused on the incident. And with that being said, we can really work towards shifting system and how as a society we engage with survivors, as well as the larger strategic process of this natural disaster. And with that being said, lastly, I'd like to invite everyone to just take a moment so that we're able to ground ourselves, as many emotions, thoughts, and feelings may have come up while I was speaking. So as we transition on to offer a very brief nervous system grounding moment, which is optional for whoever feels open to doing it. Gently place your feet on the ground. Let your shoulders soften. Without changing anything, simply notice the contact of your body with the chair, the support beneath your feet, and the natural rhythm of your breath. You don't have to breathe deeply. Just notice your breath and how your body is supporting you. And I ask you to invite safety back into your body, your heart, your mind, and your being. Gently press your feet into the floor with 3, 2, 1, and relax. I hope that this helps bridge the gap to signal safety to your nervous system. And if there's anything you need to fix in this moment, or if you notice that your body's still feeling unsettling or responding, please take time to step out and to do something that comforts you and gives you the sense of safety. Thank you all for listening to my input, and I'm looking forward to the discussions to unpack this further.
Wow. Yumna, thank you. That was absolutely incredible. I had so much that I wanted to say, but now I'm feeling grounded and feeling like I don't want to disrupt what you've really just imparted on us. But I wanted to share that there is a person on the chat who's really been engaging actively throughout your presentation, Koleka. And one of the things that Koleka put in the chat was she was saying, absolutely agreeing with what you were saying, and the aspect that the ongoing trauma can be brutal, usually private and silent, coupled with having to continue to participate in the real world as a survivor. And so her point was that the system and society in general can be very harsh, cruel, and cold to the survivor. And I know this is impromptu, Koleka. Would you, by any chance, be able to unmute and just engage with Yumna briefly? Because I feel like you've been on par throughout her presentation. And Peach,
Yes,
if you can
thank you
assist
so
me,
much.
great.
So, yes, thank you so much, Yumna. Thank you to Cameron. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for, I think it's just so profound that you can sit in a space like this and really unpack and delve deeper into the real issue behind GBV, specifically from a survivor-centered point of view, because I'm a survivor. I've been a survivor of numerous GBV incidences from the age of 13 all the way up to even as I speak to you, I'm going through such a traumatic and harsh a personal situation, but that has violated me in such a savage way in terms of just my vulnerabilities based on my gender, right? So I've taken that opportunity to use the pain and the trauma and the experience, the lived. So it resonates so deeply for me, Yumna, just your approach. I think I did earlier on in the chats to just say we literally survivor-centered modalities in whichever way we choose to proceed and go ahead. It needs to have a real, sincere, authentic, heart space approach to the survivor. The essence of even activists, thank you for bringing that in, because I'm also using my experience as a sort of advocacy as I'm going through it currently, you know. So, and I'm using this opportunity to feel and being given the space from an intellectual point of view, from an advocacy, what can I do? Where can I jump in with my lived experience? Is because I found that there are not many safe spaces at all. It's you go through most times the journey quite isolated, quite outcasted, quite frankly, and still having to maintain a sense of grace in terms, because these sort of things also come with smear narratives, right? To dehumanize, to discredit your my story, to discredit my lived experience, a sort of gaslighting by the system, Yumna, you see. So yes, there'd be advocacy groups that you can go to, but if you do not feel safe in those groups, it's already yet again compromised in terms of the trauma. Now it's no longer even secondary trauma, you know. So I'm very grateful, Joy, and I resonate deeply, and I'm very excited and very proud of the work that you ladies are doing in your own, and all of us. I'm sure there's a whole lot in this space. Shared Value Africa. Just the
Thank you so much, Koleka. And I know it was.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks, Joy.
And apologies, I think I may have actually cut you off there. It suddenly started pouring. Yumna, the heavens are responding to what you're sharing. So I'm going to pause and allow you to respond to that. And also note that there is a question in the chat around, are there channels that other GBV-centered organizations can use to connect with you for advisory or consultation on dealing with their cases? Over to you, Yumna.
Thank you so much. And just to take a moment to hold space for what you're going through, and 100% everything that you shared is what many survivors go through when looking at the reporting process. It takes a lot of courage to use what you've gone through in a role of advocacy to support others. I think many people don't realize just how much strength it takes for a survivor to play that role as well. There's so many turning wheels. And imparting, I think it would be helpful for me to share this, especially because there's other people from other universities. But for example, at UCT, we have a specialized counseling approach for survivors, which the therapists are aware then of the nuances that a survivor may experience. So, for example, like a survivor where the staff member or student doesn't communicate with the therapist for 3 weeks, and then out of nowhere says, emails and says, I have something due to submit and it's due for this evening and I can't do it. The therapist understands the nuances behind that, of the person was trying to find agency and control in the 3 weeks, trying to test their reality, like, can I survive this experience that has disrupted my life? Normally I could finish this task, so I'm going to try and try and try. And it gets to a point then where they're basically testing their reality, their worlds. Can I overcome this? Does this experience completely disrupt my whole life? And that's why when they reach out, it's often at the critical point of where things are really sort of overflowing. And so our therapists recognize that, which is slightly different to maybe the wider institutional counseling system, which requires you to demonstrate a consistent pattern of engagement. So we understand that. We understand that you cannot speak to us for 1 year and then come back and say, I need the support now, and that's fine. So we have a specialized approach to counseling. Another big thing I would say is that my role in particular, I think, is very impactful because I'm able, even where I can't make decisions, I'm able to give the assurance and the clarity to the survivor. So I'm trying to eliminate the survivor having to bounce from person to person to department, so sort of like what SAPS also does. That unknown, that uncertainty, the lack of control, all of that brings up the emotional stress patterns and trauma of what happened during the event. So people don't really understand that connection, that an everyday action is actually feeding your brain and strengthening that neural pathway of what you experience in the trauma. So what we look at is, I will try to clarify and walk the journey as far as possible. And even where I can't make decisions, I'm still there in a supportive capacity. So there's one consistent person that the survivor can rely on in terms of, I'm not having to do this in isolation or alone. And that teaches them to build trust in themselves as well as to learn to trust another person. And anyone can get into contact with me. I also sit as the student chair for the COP, so the National Community of Practice Practitioners for Gender-Based Violence, and particularly in South Africa. So Joy, if you could share my email, and anyone who requires training or would like to chat some more, my role extends into the disciplinary proceedings as well. So I'm quite familiar both with SAPS and institutional policies.
Thank you, Yumna. Absolutely incredible. I feel like we may potentially have to have a whole session with you, but thank you. We've really appreciated it. And apologies to all. I'm not sure if you can hear the thunder and the rain pouring down. I do hope you can still hear me clearly. What we'd want to do now as we relieve Yumna of the mic is to actually go into our next poll, just to gauge again a sense of where you are before we then move on to the student panel. So if you can assist me, please, Peach, by launching the poll. Thank you. And the question on the poll now is, if you witness harmful behavior or a situation that feels unsafe, how likely are you to speak up or intervene? If you witness harmful behavior or a situation that feels unsafe, how likely are you to speak up or intervene? And the responses be very likely, somewhat likely, it depends on the situation, or I don't feel confident to intervene. So would love to hear your thoughts around what your response would be. I'll give a moment or two for you to respond, and we can then get the results as soon as they are published. So please do take a moment to look at the poll on your screen to complete your responses, and let's get a sense of where everyone sits. And it's such an interesting question because we find that the majority of times when something happens, that it isn't a surprise to those around you. Very often people will have seen the lead up to the situation and have intervened. I'm sure you heard that, Nanda. I'm going to. And thank you, Peach. So the responses, I'll ask the question again, just so that we can gauge the responses. If you witness harmful behavior or a situation that feels unsafe, how likely are you to speak up or intervene? And I'm really, really encouraged by the fact that 65% of people say that they would intervene. 65% of people would intervene. And then 12% somewhat likely. And 24%, I would believe, are being very truthful in that it depends on the situation, because sometimes as a bystander, you might find yourself in equal danger. So thank you very much for your responses. And I see Caroline from our team has just posted Yumna's email address in the chat for those that would like to continue the conversation with Yumna. Please do take her details and feel free to reach out to her. And thank you again to Yumna. And so having concluded this poll, I would like to now move into our last segment, and I recognize that it's 11:08 on my Central African time. And so the time that we'll have on this session is going to be a little reduced. So to our panelists, I'd like to remind you to come on board, and please feel free to share your insights as concisely as you can, but still don't feel held back from sharing what you need to share. I do believe that this is quite a centerpiece of the session or the discussion today. Policy matters, yes, and systems matter. But what we know is that when students mobilize, culture can very often shift. And so each panelist joining us today is not only a student leader, but they're also voices within their ecosystems of shaping ecosystem level change within their context. So I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, and if you can all, I'll introduce you all at the same time, and you can all come on board, unmute, well, if you can turn on your cameras, and then we'll take the conversation one at a time. So firstly, I'd like to introduce James Bahati, who's a student leader that is deeply involved in youth-centric governance structures and leadership formation frameworks. His work focuses on capacity building for ethical leadership and student representation at institutional level, enabling young people to advocate effectively on issues affecting student well-being. James, please do unmute and say hello.
Hello to everyone.
Greetings, James. Can you share a little bit about yourself before we continue?
Okay, thank you so much. I hope everyone is seeing me very well.
Yes, we can.
Okay, my name is James Bahati. I'm honored to join this conversation as a student leader and also a founder and CEO of IODE. So because of my work with young people across Africa, hear firsthand how deeply gender inequality and safety issues affect students' lives. So today's theme on universities for purpose, creating a safe and equitable future, really speaks to me. So I think in brief, that's my presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. And I'd like to welcome on screen Cerebel Odero, who is a gender equality advocate working on youth-led mobilization, student rights, and social accountability campaigns. She has helped create student-run spaces that document grievances, amplify survivor voice, and advocate for institutional level intervention. And Sarah Bell is also working quite closely with the Shared Value Africa team. So Sarah Bell, if you can briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Joy. Kindly confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you so much. My name is Sarah Belodero. I am from Kenya, but really very much invested in the affairs of gender in the African continent. I am the Vice President of the African Leadership University, and this matter is central to me because when I was coming into office, we apparently had a sexual misconduct policy that largely touched on staff, but had a lot of loopholes for students. So I'm very interested in this conversation and looking forward to contribute. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah Bell. If you can stay on screen while we introduce Arij Mudawi, who is a medical sciences student focused on pathways into male-dominated fields, advocating for women's inclusion, career access, and psychological support. She works closely with peers in academic pressure, identity, belonging, and safe progression for young women. If you can come on board, Arij, and say something a little bit about yourself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Arij Ali Mudawi, a medical doctor and sexual and reproductive health and right trainer with IFMSA, International Federation of Medical Student Association, and also Medicine Sudan trainer. Today, I'm with you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arij. And then last but not least, I'd like to welcome on board Omar Khetswe, who serves as institutional student representative and advocate, shaping student policy recommendations and designing peer-based well-being initiatives. If you can come on board, Omar Khetswe, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. My name is Oamukete Chikwado. I am Operations Officer at Black Women Cook. I am also currently pursuing a degree in forensic science with a major in law at the University of South Africa. I am also the former Secretary General of the Student Representative Council at Tshwane South Chipet College, and I am so happy to be a part of this amazing panel, and I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Omar Khetswe. And before we continue, I want us to just give applause to Jay for allowing himself to come on board and have a conversation with only women today. So what I'll do in the interest of time is I'm going to ask exactly one question of each of our panelists. And as you respond, if someone else wants to chime in response to the same question that you have, they're welcome to do so, because we have just 27 minutes remaining. And I think my maths is not too bad. I think it's 27 minutes. So I'm going to kick off with James. And James, the question that I have for you is, what is one uncomfortable truth about student safety or gender dynamics on campus that institutions urgently need to know, or that they urgently need to acknowledge? What is being overlooked?
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to start by saying that purple, which is one of the colors that are representing today's forum, represents justice, dignity, and also strength. But for us to live up to that, we must, of course, begin with honesty. But there are some uncomfortable truths about gender equality, especially on African campuses, that I want to talk about. Although some universities, we believe that are meant to be places for learning and opportunity, so many students, especially female, they still face harassment, violence, and also discrimination on campus. So according to Shared Value Africa, that is hosting today's forum, many rape cases reported nationally in South Africa originated from university and college campuses. So, and research across Africa shows high level of violence among students. In one of the study of 2,249 students in Sub-Saharan Africa, they found that 18.7% of students experience sexual violence, and then 30.9% also experience physical violence, and the 64.9% experienced also psychological violence. So these numbers reveal a clear truth that many students do not only feel safe in spaces meant to empower them, yet we believe that universities are spaces that should empower students. So Even with the rising awareness, many survivors, of course, do not report incidents of gender-based violence. And as today's forum acknowledges that by prompting us to discuss accountability and also some trauma-based informed reform. So students nowadays, they still remain silent. Why? Because they fear not being believed, they fear academic or social retaliation, they fear being blamed, and also slow or also biased also institutional processes, because the processes at various campuses are really very biased. So in many cases, I would say that students rely on whisper networks to warn each other about unsafe lecturers or spaces. Instead of trusting the institution to protect them, yeah, now they trust their peers. I think that alone shows how unsafe students feel. So I would also talk about some truth about online spaces that now also create a new risk because of today's much of student life happens online. And so that's harm. Like say, like now students are in different WhatsApp groups for different courses that they are taking. So digital gender-based violence is also growing fast. So there is harassment, non-consensual image sharing, cyber stalking, and also intimidation. And I think all these affect students both on and off campus. So this aligns with the broader global spotlight on digital violence during this year activist campaigns that were taken by Shared Value Africa. So for many young women, I think their fear is not only walking home at night, but it is opening their phone in the morning because of digital gender-based violence. So there are some of the real examples of these challenges. I think I can share a few of them. A student who reported the harassment from a lecturer was advised to handle it quietly to avoid damaging the lecturer's reputation. And in many residencies, female students know exactly which corridors or some common areas feel unsafe and which male students to avoid. So, and also on some campuses, there are leaked images of female students circulating in WhatsApp groups, yet very few institutions have formal policies to respond to this digital harm. So I think these examples show that gender inequality is not only about isolated incidents, but it's built also into campus culture. So I think that's the reality about it. I can also talk about some of the solutions if you allow me. But since time is very short, I would like to get a permission from you, Joy, before I move forward.
You put me under pressure there, James. How can I say no? Please go
Okay,
ahead.
thank you. Okay, so there are some practical solutions that can be taken immediately for creating a very safe and also equitable future, especially for students. Um, the good news is change is possible, as we all know, and many solutions are really very realistic. Solution one, I think institutions should be trauma, I think they should focus on informing students on trauma, and also they should become maybe, could I say, survivor-centered support. As highlighted in today's forum, I think universities must adopt trauma-informed systems. In brief, I would say this looks like confidential, simple reporting options, which universities should also have trained counselors and survivor support specialists that are just there to support students. They should also provide protection from retaliation. They should also provide fast and predictable case handling systems. So I think a safe reporting process will encourage students to speak up. The second solution will be strengthening institutional accountability, because we all know that accountability restores trust. So universities, they can publish anonymized annual GBV reports. They can use independent panels to handle cases. They can also enforce consequences consequently. They can also train staff on ethics, gender sensitivity, and also power dynamics. So when institutions act accordingly and consistently, I think students will feel safer. And
Indeed.
universities will be safe places where students will feel empowered, heard, and also important. So the last solution, I think I still have one. It's equipping students to be allies, not bystanders, because most cultures change. Because most students' culture change. So I think universities should provide some practical solutions that are like mandatory consent education. They should also maybe help to set up student-led safety clubs and also advocacy groups. They also should provide peer support networks for survivors. Yeah, because students often see harm first. So they must also be empowered to intervene safely and also to contribute on how they can also solve these challenges, like as I've said, by leading safety clubs to support their fears. So another last solution would be addressing digital safety with the same seriousness as physical safety. So I think university, they should also adopt some policies that address cyberbullying, image-based abuse, also online harassment, and also misuse of student WhatsApp or Telegram groups. Yeah, because as we all know, digital harm is real harm. It's real harm,
Indeed.
and institutions must also respond accordingly. So by closing, I think to honor the Purple campaign, we must move from awareness to action. And that starts with acknowledging a honest truth. We cannot build
Indeed.
ethical leaders or thriving communities in spaces where fear, silence, and violence persist. So if we want campuses defined by dignity, justice, and safety, then we must first speak openly about uncomfortable truth. We must support survivors with compassion, and we must build also systems that protect and also not silence students. So
For sure.
to cut this short, I would just say thank you so much, and I look forward for the discussion and more questions. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, James. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking about whether we have enough research that actually helps to expose the ugly truth and the realities. I don't think we do, especially when it comes to tertiary institutions and higher education institutions. So thank you for your contribution. And in the interest of time, I want to move on to Arij. And as I do so, there are a couple of questions. There's one question in particular that has popped up in the chat. So as you wait for your turn, please have a look at the question to see if you can engage with it. But in the meantime, Arij, the question I had for you is that often campus change begins informally, that it happens amongst peers and often in unofficial initiatives. So could you share an example of informal organizing that you have seen leading to real outcomes?
Okay, one example of informal organizing that I believe should yield real outcomes is the peer safety circles that students create among themselves. These are small unofficial groups where young women warn each other about the unsafe individuals, share concerns privately, and support friends who are afraid to report incidents.
Looks like.
Arij, thank you. Do you want to add more to that?
Even though these circles are informal, they already protect students. If the universities listen to the patterns coming from these groups, they could transform them into formal reporting systems, safer policies, and strong prevention program.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
That's really great. And thank you. I recognize that you're wanting to keep it concise because of the time aspect. So if you don't mind, I'll actually jump right through to Sarah Bell, and I appreciate your input. And Sarah Bell, the question for you is, where have student-run or peer-led mechanisms, which is something that Arij just alluded to, where have they succeeded where formal structures might not or did not? And what do you think the reason was for that?
All right, so thank you so much. So I was just going through the chat and I saw something about having protection mechanisms for the survivor supporters as well. And one thing you look at that when the survivors are not willing to speak out, it's often the supporters who in this case is classmates or friends. So again, when they're not protected, it becomes an issue. And in this regard, when students come in to speak against the issue at hand, for example, at my institutions, students literally had to boycott class, and the university was trying to keep it under wraps. They were trying to threaten us, telling us, oh, you know, the government does not support strikes here in Rwanda, or, you know, if you do this, you're going to face sanctions. And students said, we are not going to attend class unless you hear us, because it turns out that even the report mechanisms were not working, because we're supposed to report to our professors. So they were the ones who are supposed to report to, and they're also the ones we have in class, and some of them are the perpetrators as well. So I think when you talk about peer-led mechanisms, they do really work, because when we stand in solidarity with each other, our voices, I think it's one mechanism also worked quite well. I mean, we just boycott them and we call sanctions against them, and you're not shaming them in terms of we're saying we are the law and you're suspects and we are calling you out on everything. We're just saying something needs to be done. Someone spoke out against you, and if you feel like you didn't do anything, go and report them as well as yourself. So I think these are just some of the things we can do as peers to ensure that we stand with survivors as well as call perpetrators to order. Thank you, Joy.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarabel. You broke off briefly, but I think we caught exactly what you were saying. And I think you touched on something that is really important, not just in tertiary institutions, but even in the private sector, because we see it come up a lot. And it's the aspect of the role of leadership, and how many times we hear that the leaders are the perpetrators themselves. So they need to also take a stance to move away from this and walk the talk. So thank you for that contribution. And I want to now move on to Omakhetwe. And if you had university leadership directly in front of you, like right now, what is the one non-negotiable that you would demand from them?
Thank you so much, Joy, for the question. I'd really love to go straight ahead and answer the question, but I do believe that before I answer such a very, not too complex, but such an important question, I do also want to give a brief background of the final answer, of course. And if you could just allow me, I want to take still on the time that my fellow panelists did not use, and maybe use it for myself to just information. And so I just want to maybe just give a brief background also of Black Women Caucus. So Black Women Caucus is a feminist, youth-led and intergenerational social movement that does work around advocacy against gender-based violence and femicide. The organization was founded in 2017 in response to the prevalence of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. Now, the organization is organized across 3 divisions. We've got our Black Girls in Caucus, which is the high school division of Black Women Caucus. We have our Black Women Caucus, which is the founding division of the organization, as well as the Berakamusari, which is the older women. So when we say intergenerational, we really speak about from baby till the grave. So we're not biased on the kind of people and the people, women and men, by the way, that we invite into our organization. And also just to say that, just to share that Black Women Caucus is a community-based organization that does work on prevention, education, community mobilization, as well as implementing the pillars of the NSP, the National Strategic Plan. If you can allow me to just share that pillar 2 that focuses on prevention and rebuilding social cohesion through programs like Operation Letapala, which is led by our Baraka Musadi initiative, our hashtag Make My School Safe initiative that focuses on creating safer schools through projects like the anti-bullying campaign. Pillar 3 that focuses on justice, safety, and protection. We are strategic MOU partners to the SAP Secretariat member. Pillar 4 that focuses on care and support healing. We have our crisis of care helpline. That is an online social psychosocial support service that is offered to those that need it. Pillar 5, which focuses on economic power. We are members of the GEF, and we are also intentional about saying fund the fight against gender-based violence and femicide. And Black Women Caucus's mission is clear. We want to create safer spaces, more equitable and just safe spaces for women and girls, gender-expansive people and communities across South Africa. Now, I want to go into the different challenges the different gender-based violence challenges that we find in universities and TVET colleges. We often find sexual harassment by fellow students, lecturers, supervisors, and student support staff, by the way. We have a lot of power imbalances leading to academic cohesion and unequal relationships. We have a lot of victim blaming and fear, and this discourages reporting, violence against whoever it may be that is experiencing violence. We hear of a lot of stigma and the lack of confidentiality around gender-based violence cases. I think one of my speakers did really mention the sensitivity around gender-based violence and how you deal with, survivors. We don't call them victims. We always would like to refer to them as survivors, because they are very brave enough to come out and share their stories and lived experiences. And this is very important that when you deal with victims, here and I again saying victims, survivors of GBV, you are very mindful of the language that you use. You're very sensitive also in how you ask certain questions. Another challenge we face is a lot of unsafe campus environments. So your poor lighting, isolated areas, inadequate security. Harassment is also especially prevalent during orientation and social events which are held by the SRC. I want to focus on the TVET colleges now. Now, what are the TVET specific challenges, right? We have
I apologize for jumping in. I just need to warn you because we're actually 1 minute past time. So if you can be as concise as you can be while delivering your points, I'd be grateful.
Okay, I'm going to speak so fast. I'm going to rap, but please, I hope you're going to hear me. So, in TVET College, we find very few GBVF response and prevention resources, limited counseling, less formal policies, and unsafe transport and accommodation options. I also want to speak about the sexual violation towards female students in leadership positions. We often find that female students in leadership positions face heightened risks of sexual violation due to the visibility and influence they hold on campus. These violations are not only attacks on individuals, but also attempts to undermine their authority and silence their voices. Perpetrators exploit power imbalances. We hear stories of our male SRC members abusing or harassing our female student, leaders who want to contest for positions in the higher ranks. Your chairperson, your secretary chairperson, your treasurer generals. We often find, our male students really giving the female students a harsh time. And so maybe let me just jump onto the question. Addressing gender-based violence in higher education is very important. And I also want to touch on why prevention is very important, preventing more than responding to GBV, right? Because a lot of our young people, we like to hop onto campaigns and to initiatives that are all about creating awareness through marching and the likes, but nobody actually really does the prevention work. Nobody wants to touch on how we can protect each other from gender-based violence and femicide within our institutions of higher learning. And universities and colleges should be safe environments for learning and personal growth, yet many young women face heightened risks. Now, prevention matters because it offers sustainable solutions beyond emergency responses. It helps transform campus culture and perpetuate rape culture. It also supports students who are often away from home and familiar support systems for the first time. It addresses both individual behaviors and structural factors such as policies, reporting mechanisms, campus design, and resident safety. Now, the role of universities, and I think I'm getting to the answer to the question. What is the role of universities in fighting gender-based? As I conclude, universities must lead actively in combating gender-based violence by institutionalizing clear policies that define, prevent, and respond to gender-based violence. They should establish and enforce strict codes of conduct with real consequences for violations, create transparent, accessible, and trauma-informed reporting mechanisms to encourage survivors to come forward without the fear of retaliation and stigmatization, provide survivor-centered support services, including counseling, legal aid, and protection available both on and off campus. They also need to promote comprehensive GBV awareness and prevention education integrated into orientation, curricula, and community events to shift harmful cultural norms. And in closure, for the real now, what is the way forward and what needs to change? We need to collectively, and this does not only lie on the responsibility of institutions, this does not rely only on the responsibility of the Student Representative Council, but the students also, the security members, everybody really needs to be at the table in order for us to change this really, really big pandemic that we're facing. We need to firstly strengthen and fully enforce gender-based violence policies at all higher educational institutions, including TVET colleges. We need to ensure every campus has dedicated GBV response units. We need to provide GBV sensitivity training for security personnel. We also need to increase access to safe, reliable transports for students, improve communication on reporting challenge and survivor rights, involve students meaningfully in policy development and decision-making. We need to foster feminist organizing spaces like Black Women Caucus across campuses. We need to integrate prevention programs within orientation, curricula, and daily campus life. And most importantly, let us move from campaigns and convenient activism and get into the movement of creating movement building and encourage movement building amongst ourselves as peers, students, leaders, and support staff. And so that is my show and tell for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Omakhetso. And I'm so sad that we've come to this time where we've had to rush you through this. But I do have two options for you. Number one is you can do a blog for us. Number two is you could be on our podcast. So we'll have that conversation separately. And now, because we've really, really run out of time, and I do appreciate everyone for staying on these extra few minutes in addition, what I know is that Arid was very gracious in trying to rush because she understood the time constraints. So Arid, what I'm now going to ask you to do is to do the closing that I would have done in 2 minutes.
Okay. I just want to add a small brief point, okay?
Go for it.
I have worked closely with the students on sexual and reproductive health, consent, and creating safe spaces. So over the years, I have seen how even small workshops can make a huge difference, helping students feel more confident, safe, and empowered. It's amazing how a single conversation or training session can change how students see themselves, how they set boundaries, and how they interact with others on campuses. So what students need most is not just knowledge, but trust, safety, and systems that actually respond when they report harm. When these elements are in place, students feel valued and empowered to take part in building safer campuses.
Yes.
Yeah.
Arid, I want to thank you because I think you've actually taken us back to right at the very top, which was a point made about don't underestimate the power of starting small. So I appreciate you closing with that. And I now need to wrap up.
Okay.
Sorry, I do need to wrap up because I respect that other people may have immediate appointments to go to. So before I do so, I just want to thank every single person that has contributed today, our participants for joining the call, our speakers for coming to impart insights, every student panelist, and really just for making the time on this very last day of the 16 days of activism. I think, a lot has rung true today, but what I really want to take away most actually is that universities cannot remain neutral. Neutrality protects the status quo, and silence enables repeated harm. So I think what we need to understand is that the soft responses that we've been getting just prolong trauma. And when students lead, institutions actually can listen and will listen. So my closing note today is that let this not end our voice, let it not be the end of our voice, but let it actually be the beginning of accountability and continuing to push for accountability. I want to really thank you all for showing up today. I know it is silly season officially, so many people can't even take the time to join calls anymore, but I do thank you for joining and for participating meaningfully. Let's move beyond awareness into responsibility and reform. Thank you all so much, and I wish you a pleasant day further. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.